Hello, my quilting friends. My name is Leah Day, and welcome to this quarter square triangle tutorial. So quarter square triangles are a really neat unit. You end up with two smaller triangles, then a nice big triangle in one corner. And as you can see, these are asymmetrical. So whatever you have on one, the fabrics are going to be lined up a little differently in the other. And you're also going to get a different effect depending on what fabrics you choose. So here I started with two scrappy squares, and then I pieced a nice piece of black background fabric. Here I started with a scrappy square and a piece of background, then pieced a second piece of background fabric, and I ended up with this effect. So you can get a lot of really interesting shapes with quarter square triangles, and I want to show you how to make them. So the first step is to get your squares together. I'm going to make one of the super scrappy quarter square triangles, the one that looks like this. So I'm going to have two scraps and then a piece of background fabric pieced on. So I'm going to start with my scrappy squares, just layering those right sides together. Then grab a marking pencil and a ruler and line that up going corner to corner, just like so. And mark a nice straight line. Now we're going to take this to the machine and stitch a 1/4 inch to either side. And here's what that's going to look like. So I've stitched a 1/4 inch exactly from that marked line here to the left and then also to the right. And if this feels familiar to you, it's because this is the exact same set of steps that we do for half square triangles. And I have another tutorial on making half square triangles, so definitely check that out. Okay, so I'm just carefully cutting right across on that marked line, and you can see we now have two really cute half square triangles. And what I want you to do is take these and press that seam allowance open. I like to run my fingernail along it and then grab a hot dry iron. I don't put water in my iron, and give it a good press. So this is just nice and hot and dry, and it gets that seam allowance nice and flat. So for half square triangles at this point, we would be trimming these down to fit our quilt. For quarter square triangles, you do not trim them down. You want to leave these at the size that they're at, and they're going to be kind of a weird size right now. So just keep that in mind. If this is coming out at 1/8 of an inch weirdness, don't worry, it's a-okay. So now we're going to turn these into quarter square triangles, and we do that by grabbing another piece of fabric, and this is the background fabric that I'm using. I'm going to place this right side up. Obviously this is a solid, but if this was a print, it would be right side up. And then I take my half square triangle and place that right side down on top. Do that again. And as you can see, for every set of squares that you work with, you're going to end up with two. So out of this set here, I'm going to have 4 quarter square triangles at the end. So it's really nice, and you make a lot of units for a very small amount of fabric. Okay, so again, what I'm going to do is just center this up so that way it's nice and centered over that background square. And you can see I cut that background square just a little bit bigger. I do that on purpose so I don't have to cut a weird 1/8 of an inch measurement. And it also gives you just a little bit more wiggle room. So now I'm going to take my ruler and I'm going to go across this way, perpendicular to that seam we just stitched. And I'm lining this up, and I'm going to mark another line right across. So exactly the same way that we made our half square triangles before, I'm going to mark that line, take this to the machine, and stitch exactly a 1/4 inch to either side. So let's jump on the machine. I'll show you how to do that. Here at my machine, I've stitched through a scrap charger just so that way I double check that my machine won't gag on me as I take the first stitch. I've also lowered my stitch length here to 1.5 millimeters, so that way I produce a nice, tight, consistent stitch, and that allows me to press my seam allowances open. So now I'm just lining up the edge of my patchwork foot here with the marked line right down the middle of those squares. And I always like to piece this way with the seam allowances on top just so I can see them. And I just stitch all the way down. Now I'm going to grab another scrap charger, and there's really nothing big about this. It's just simply a scrap of fabric. You take it and fold it in half. And this just keeps your machine in stitching mode, so that, every time that you have those long thread tails, you have a risk of breaking thread and having everything gag on you. I really like to keep my machine stitching and reduce anything I can do to stop that from happening. So here we go. Now I'm going to stitch along the opposite side, and here I'm just lining up the edge of that patchwork foot right with that line that I've marked. And this is nice because I like having a patchwork foot where I have a 1/4 inch to both sides. Not all patchwork feet are designed that way, but it's really convenient when you're working on things like half square triangles, 1/4 square triangles, and hourglass units. That's going to be another tutorial coming up soon. So the last step is just to trim these apart. I'm going to cut right along that marked diagonal line. And that's going to break them apart, and then you open them up and you see really cute 1/4 square triangles. Now again, I piece with a short stitch length so that way I can finger press this seam allowance open and flat. I do that just to reduce bulk behind my quilt so that way it's nice and flat, it's easier to machine quilt. So there we go, and you can see how we have kind of two different looks. If you're piecing something in particular, that has, great use of color, then you're going to have to pay attention to that. With the blocks in the Friendship Quilt Along, we're just going for super scrappy happy. So it really doesn't matter which way it's pointing, whether you have, this triangle right here or that triangle right there, it doesn't matter either way. But you can see you get an asymmetrical result every time. Now the last step here is to trim these up and get them to the right size for your pattern. So let me show you that next. And I'm using this little spinny mat just because it's nice and convenient. And I'm going to start by squaring off one side. And I first lined up that diagonal 45-degree line through the middle of that 1/4 square triangle. I'm also looking over here and lining up this 45-degree angle and making sure that that line is lining up with the mark on the ruler, the size that I'm actually cutting this down to. So now we're going to rotate, just spin it around. It's really convenient to have one of these types of mats for this kind of thing. You don't ever want to cut across the top of your ruler. I cut myself really badly doing that once, and that's one of those things that I think is really important to mention. Don't ever cut across the top. Even when you have it like this and everything's all lined up and it's just absolutely perfect, cutting across the top, it's really easy to just hop up on top of the ruler and cut yourself. Okay, so now I've squared off basically two sides. So now I'm lining up with the cut size I'm working with, which is 4 inches. I'm also lining up the 45-degree line here and making sure that that line is coming out right on that 4-inch mark as well. So lining all of those things up nicely. And you kind of have to wiggle it just a little bit here and there if it's not lining up just exactly right. I'm going to cut off one side, always cutting with my dominant hand on the side that's convenient to my dominant hand. Rotate again, line that up nicely, make sure nothing is slipped out of shape, and make that last cut. So make sure to take your time piecing your 1/4 square triangles and trimming them up so that they're the correct size for your pattern. So that's it for this tutorial. I'm going to be using those 1/4 square triangles to create this beautiful patchwork mosaic quilt block. This is the second quilt block for the Friendship Quilt Along. You can learn more and join in the fun of piecing and quilting a beautiful scrappy happy quilt block every month. Learn more at leahday.com/friendship. Until next time, let's go quilt.